Okay, today we are going to talk about the symphonic orchestra. This is going to be a very quick rundown of the symphonic orchestra, but I find a lot of people don't actually know the instruments in the orchestra, what their placement is, what their ranges are, what the purpose of them is. People generally just think orchestra and they think strings, and there's something about woodwinds and brass, but they don't really know what woodwinds are or brass is. So we're going to do the Symphonic Orchestra 101, and this is going to be a quick rundown. This actual slideshow has details of stuff that you don't need to memorize, but things that are helpful. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown very quickly, and then everything else is going to be something that you just reference online or with this slideshow in the future. So, Symphonic Orchestra 101. So the modern symphony orchestra is divided into four main families: woodwind, brass, percussion, and strings. Woodwinds utilize air with or without reeds, which are like little pieces of fibrous wood, to produce sound. They're versatile for color and expression. They are the main thing for color, I would say, in an orchestra. Brass use air and the embouchure of their lips to produce the sound. They can be aggressive, harmonic context, color. The percussion, really, if we're thinking about the four sections, there's actually kind of five, because I split pitched and unpitched percussion into two different categories. So pitched percussion are for harmonic texture, meaning like chords and sometimes melodies and stuff, like a marimba, any of the keyboard instruments that you're playing with like mallets. Sometimes accents and stuff like a timpani, while unpitched is basically just rhythm, accents, groove, stuff like that. And then the strings are the core part of the orchestra. They are the largest section. There are many, many members of the string section. They produce sound by vibrating the strings, by bowing it, plucking it, or striking it. They are the core part of the orchestra. And generally, there are additional instruments used. So you'll see harp on stage, I think almost every time. I think every time I've been to a symphony, I've seen harp on stage in some context, even if it's not being used. And then piano, and then choir. Choir is done in things like Beethoven's Ninth and Lord of the Rings. It's not always a part of the orchestra. It's not always part of the sound. Same thing with piano. There are always additional instruments you can add, but the core is really these four: the woodwinds, brass, percussion, and strings. And actually, the reason they are in this order here, even though it seems kind of backwards because you would think strings would be the main thing, is this is the order that they appear in on sheet music. Okay, the usual suspects. So again, I mentioned there's the usual stuff, and then there's all sorts of stuff that change. Anything here that is bolded and with an asterisk is pretty much there every time. So with woodwinds, you typically have flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons. The flautist will double on piccolo, or sometimes you have an extra player for that. Same thing with the oboes with the English horn, or cor anglais, which is sometimes called. I think that's like the French version or something. And then brass, you pretty much see all of them: French horns, trumpets, tenor, trombones, and tuba. Bass trombone, again, is an alternate for the trombone players. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Pitched percussion, you basically see timpani every time. The other ones, honestly, they're kind of mixed. Like sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't, but I think I see a timpani on stage basically every time. Unpitched percussion, you pretty much always see bass drums, snare drums, cymbals. I would say snares probably less common than like a bass drum, but I think there's a bass drum on stage every time I go to an orchestra. And then things like triangle, gong, other stuff like that are there, but not always used. And then you have your strings: first and second violins, violas, cellos, and basses. Violins, there's no difference between the first and second violins mechanically. They are the same instrument, but there are always two sections of them. They are always split, more so than the others, and that's because there's just so many of them, and the strings are the core part of the orchestra, that you actually really have 5 string sections. You don't have 4. And then choirs. Again, choir's not always there: sopranos, altos, tenors, baritones, basses. That's typically how it would be arranged. So, symphonic proportions. Orchestras vary in size depending on style, genre. The classical era, which is like Mozart, Beethoven kind of era, is definitely a different orchestra than the Romantic era, where like if Beethoven was the transition from the classical to Romantic, which people could argue about that all day, but The Romantic era, if you think of things like Wagner, those are very different orchestras. And modern film scoring is also completely different. In modern film scoring, we have a core concept of what the usual orchestra is, but things get changed a lot. We have a lot of ranges and creativity going on in film scoring, game scoring, stuff like that. So your typical symphonic orchestra, the larger ones, are like 70 plus players, many string players. And then chamber orchestras are smaller, like 40 or less. And then in the modern era, the numbers change to meet the composer's needs. Obviously, you probably wouldn't have some really weird number of like 90 strings and 1 clarinet and 2 tenor trombones or something. There is still some structure to it for a reason, but if you want to get really creative, there's no rules. So the woodwinds, they're usually in pairs. So there's usually 2 of each of them. And then, as I mentioned, woodwind players are sort of expected to double on other woodwind instruments. And so sometimes they swap to another one, or they bring in an extra player to do that. So flute will sometimes swap to piccolo. Oboes will swap to English horn. These instruments are similar. Same thing with clarinets, swapping to bass clarinet, which is a similar instrument. Bassoon swapping to contrabassoon, which is a similar instrument. So the bass clarinet, contrabassoon, those are like the lower equivalents. Piccolo is like the higher equivalent of flutes. They're similar. So then you have brass. Brass ranges from 4 really to 8. And honestly, however many we want at this point. The French horns can vary, but we have a lot of French horns these days, and especially in modern film scoring. So then trumpets, 2, sometimes more. Trombones, which is usually tenors. I would say it's normally like 2. I don't always see 3. If they do have a bass, great. And then sometimes it goes up to 4. Tuba, I basically never see more than 1 tuba. But you can have 2 tubas. That does happen sometimes, but I pretty much only ever see 1. Percussion, timpani is typically 1 player with 4 actual drums. Sometimes they have 5. I don't think people usually go up to 6 or higher with them. And then you have additional percussionists to cover things like bass drum, snares, cymbals, etc. And they're not like dedicated on that instrument. They're moving around during the program to different instruments. And then the strings. Strings are the largest section. So first violins, 14 to 16. Again, if it's chamber or something, you could have like 8 to 12. So it's all variable, but these are just averages: 14 to 16, 12 to 14 for second violins, 10 to 12 for violas, 8 to 12 for cellos. Double basses, 6 to 8. Again, it's all variable. Some professional orchestras these days only have like 5 double bass players. And so that's kind of dependent on like how many people they can afford and stuff like that. So, and then you have others. Harp is 1, sometimes 2. I've definitely seen 2 harpists on stage before. And then you've got things like pianos, organs, all the keyboard stuff, choir as needed, etc. If you'll notice, there's something very interesting going on here with the size of the strings versus everything else. The strings have a much larger size. And the reason for that is there's really 2 reasons. One is the volume that strings produce is nowhere near the volume that, say, brass produce. Brass are extremely loud. They can get super loud. But in order to compensate for that, you can't just have like 2 violins for every 1 trumpet, as an example, because the way acoustics work is if you have 1 violin playing mezzo forte and another violin playing mezzo forte, you're not 2 times the volume and dynamic of mezzo forte. You're less than that, because the acoustics don't just like double in volume. And so in order to get a volume level that matches the rest of the ensemble, you have to have many players. And the other reason for that is actually pitch. So I'm convinced that violin is the hardest instrument on the planet. There's probably some obscure things that are harder, but the string players, you have to remember that their pitch is never truly perfect. And it's because when they're playing, they could shift their finger like a millimeter, and then their pitch goes up a few cents, down a few cents, or a little sharp, little flat, and stuff like that. And so as a general rule with strings, Having a bunch of players gives you a chorus effect. Technically, you will have a chorus effect as long as you have 3 or more. But with more players, you get a chorus effect that makes the perceived pitch sound cleaner. And it's that traditional sound that we all know. And this is also true for choirs. You will hear this in choirs, but choirs, I think, can lock in with each other easier than string players can. So the orchestral arrangement, as expected, placement of the orchestra is subject to change. However, there are some standards that are usually consistent. So the violins are typically left and left center. Violins will never be on the right. Violins will pretty much never be on the right. Violas can be centered or slightly right. The cellos are pretty much right, sometimes like center right. And then the basses are always deep right. In this situation, they're a little further back and the cellos are on the front. Oftentimes I'll see basses like right here on the front of it, but it's all subject to change. The general idea is left to right is high to low, somewhere in there. And then the same thing with the woodwinds. So you see our woodwinds in this image here. So centered and arranged from left to right. Sometimes they're in 2 rows, which is what we have here. We have 2 rows. Sometimes it's only 1, sometimes it's 2. Depends on the staging. Oftentimes it's just the conductor deciding the staging. And then you have the brass. So behind the woodwinds, center-ish, left to right. Usually I see them leaning slightly more right, which actually we can see here too. So he's starting right here, right, with your trumpet, and your tuba is all the way over here, which is actually kind of starting on the right. You'll notice they're not going to the left. They actually sort of lean right. And then the percussion is like the entire back row. The positioning for the percussion is pretty much always different. There's some standards, but even in this image, so the timpanis are back here on the right. I feel like most of the time I see timpanis over here, like on the left, and I see bass drums and stuff over here. It's up to you, it's up to the composer, it's up to the conductor, all of these things. And then harp and piano are usually on the left side, which actually you see the 2 harps right here. Piano would be like right here-ish usually, or at the very, very front if it's like a solo. And then the choir is usually center in the back, standing on risers. Sometimes they can be back left, sometimes they can be back right, depending on context. But as a general rule, high to low, left to right, don't swap that. It really messes with people. And by people, I mean me and people who work in the industry. If you put your violins on the right and your basses on the left, that's just going to sound wrong to me. It's technically not wrong because there are no rules in that subjectivity of that, but it does sound wrong. Okay, so we're going to go very quickly over the woodwinds. So I don't expect anyone to memorize all of this information. Some great orchestrators have all of this information memorized, but there are things to note about the ranges and the transposition if you are writing for sheet music. So woodwinds have transposing instruments, so do brass, strings don't. Transposing instruments basically at their core is the written note that the instrument is reading is a different note than what is actually sounding. So what we hear in sounding, we call the key of C. We say it's in the key of C, even if we're playing in the key of B flat or whatever. It's concert pitch. Concert pitch is like the key of C, quote unquote. So if something like the flute is in the key of C, it means it's as written, right? And then other stuff are in. For example, the clarinet is in B flat, typically, and so that one transposes. So what they're reading and what is sounding is different. And don't ask me the whole history behind this. It goes back a long ways. It's actually really annoying and not super practical in the modern era, especially because we use sample libraries. And when you're using a sample library, almost nothing is transposing unless it's an octave transposition. So for example, piccolos, older piccolos, I think, like really old ones, had a minor ninth transposition instead. But yeah, unless it's like an octave transposition thing, transposition is not in a thing in the sample library world. The note that you play on your keyboard is the note that is being produced. You just have to make sure you're in the right octave for it. So that being said, I don't expect anyone to memorize all of this, but generally, this goes from high to low. The difference, though, is that woodwinds specifically are the color of the orchestra. Woodwinds sound quite different from each other. They don't sound similar. Whereas strings are super homogeneous, right? A violin basically sounds like a viola, which sounds like a cello, which sounds like a bass. They basically all sound exactly the same except for range. The main distinction between them is the range of them, not necessarily the timbre of them. Timbrally, they sound like 95% the same thing. That is not the case with woodwinds. Woodwinds all sound quite different. So we're going to go through them. So this is the piccolo, and I'm actually going to play this for you so you can get an idea of what the piccolo sounds like. So these are the BBC Symphony Orchestra. This is a solo piccolo. Right? So that's your typical piccolo sound. And then we have flute. Flute is like the adult version of the piccolo, but actually the piccolo is like the baby version of the flute. So flute is the larger one. These are not reed instruments. They're played with just air, and they're held to the side. So this is going to be a solo flute here. There's a large jump there that I did. Typically someone wouldn't do a large jump like that. But there's things to note about these two. So for example, flute is really good at like playing scalar runs and playing very quickly. Like that's something that flute is really good at. And as you meet with players, work with players, all that sort of stuff, and watch videos online of professional players playing these instruments, you'll start to pick up on the things that these instruments can do better. And so these are made out of metal, obviously, and there's not a reed on them. And then we have oboe. So oboe is a reed instrument. It's actually a double reed instrument. It's the one that tunes the orchestra at the beginning. And it's really, really nasally sounding. So let me see here. You hear how that sound is very, very different from the flute and the piccolo that we were just doing? Yeah, very, very nasal sounding. The English horn, I actually don't have an English horn pulled up here, but the English horn is very similar. It's sort of just like a lower version of it, but it does sound very similar to the oboe. And then you've got clarinet. Clarinets, you'll hear clarinets all the time. Clarinets to me are honky, I would say, is a good way to describe them. And so they're sort of a mid-range instrument. Yeah, so they're kind of honky. They have a couple different registers. They have 3 different registers. There's like a little switch thing on the back for getting into the highest register, I think. I'm not a clarinet player. I did play clarinet for 2 seconds because I had to learn it for school. But yeah, so clarinet's a transposing instrument. It's kind of honky. The bass clarinet is essentially the same thing. You see it here. It's bigger. It has lower notes. I don't have a bass clarinet pulled up here either. And then we've got bassoon. So bassoon is effectively the bass instrument of the woodwinds, and again, sounds pretty different. So it's a double reed instrument. Oh, clarinet's a single reed, by the way. So bassoon, double reed instrument. It sounds like the bass instrument, but what's so interesting about bassoon to me is it doesn't have the oomph that the other bass instruments have. So the tuba and the bass of the other sections have a little bit more oomph, and bassoon doesn't have that as much. Yeah. It has this like mid-high resonance to it, which is so interesting. It almost sounds like a baritone singing low notes or something, trying to make the low notes happen. It's a very interesting sound. And then the contrabassoon is the more deep version of that. And I don't have a sample pulled up of that right now, but sounds similar. Cool. Moving on, going on to brass. So with our brass, we have French horn, trumpet, tenor trombone, bass trombone, and tuba. French horn is the different one to me. They all sort of sound relatively similar. They don't sound as similar as the strings, but they are semi-homogeneous for sure. The French horn is the one that is definitely more mellow. It can be aggressive, but it's most of the time it's less aggressive, and it's often paired with the woodwinds. I consider the French horn to be like a half brass, half woodwind instrument, which, speaking of literal half brass, half woodwind instruments, saxophone is technically a woodwind, but is not really found in orchestras very often, by the way. So French horn is a brass instrument, but to me, it kind of functions a little bit more like a woodwind at times, but it is brass. So French horn is your heroic one. That's the one that's like the hero themes. And so if you do large jumps and stuff, you're instantly going to sound heroic with the French horn. And if I actually like mod wheel that. So you'll hear it actually does have some bite to it, right? It definitely has. It has some bite to it. But it's just a little bit warmer, I think, than the other ones. And that one is transposing, and then just pay attention, right? There are transposing instruments here. There's also different versions of them, so trumpets have different versions, stuff like that. So trumpet is your high voice, really, I think, of the orchestra in terms of the brass. So horns are this like mid-rangey kind of thing, but they're written above on the actual sheet music. They're above trumpets. But so trumpets are your high brass. Oh, thought I had a note higher than that. That's the top note I have for the sample library. Yeah. So that's another thing to consider is there's actual ranges to these instruments, but the range that you have when we're doing digital orchestration is the range that you have in your library. And keep that in mind, because sometimes players can't play that range, and sometimes players can play beyond that range. Tenor trombone. So tenor trombone is the standard trombone. It's the one that people see most of the time. It's like the baritone equivalent, basically. Here it actually does have it's got some low notes in there. It's good. It's great for low harmonic context. Sometimes it'll take melody. Take note that the tenor trombone uses a slide. It's the one that's doing that kind of stuff. There are some deep study that you can do into trombones with partials and harmonics and all that sort of stuff. As a general rule, talk to a trombone player. Don't try to figure it out yourself. And then bass trombone is very similar. I actually have a bass trombone here. So bass trombones have like a trigger on them that lets them get the lower notes. And then tuba. Tuba is the bass equivalent of the brass section. But you don't have to always use these in the low range, so tubas can also be pretty up high. You hear how when that's a little bit more intimate, and same thing with the trombones and stuff too, when they're a little bit more intimate, they can kind of start to sound like each other. They can be a little bit homogeneous. So they're not exactly like the strings. You can tell the difference usually, but it's worth noting that they are kind of similar. Pitched percussion. Okay, pitched percussion. So you've got your timpani, Timpani are the big brass drums here. They typically have like animal hide or something on them, and there's usually one player playing those. There's 4 or 5 of them usually. They have to be tuned because there's pitch instrument, and people aren't really tuning them and changing their pitches between or in the middle of a set or anything. So keep that in mind, that they're not necessarily used for harmonic language, but they do have notes. To me, they function more like an unpitched drum, but they have pitch to them. So they have a similar effect as a bass drum, but they have pitch to it, and they are kind of actually harsh in some ways. They're kind of brassy. Big and really brassy, like metallic sounding, if you will. Yeah. So then you've got your keyboard instruments, which are xylophone, marimba, glockenspiel, vibraphone. There's probably more of them. Marimba is wood, vibraphone is metal. So there's different versions of them. Vibraphone plugs in and has like a vibrato kind of thing. So here's like a glockenspiel, if it wants to play. Then you've got your xylophone, vibraphone, marimba. Cool. So your keyboard instruments are played with 2 mallets or 4 mallets. So it would be 1 in each hand, or sometimes they split them, so 2 in each hand. So they can do some really interesting stuff actually by having the 4 different mallets. But if you're doing that, you got to be aware of like what's actually physically possible. The really good ones can pull off some stuff that seems nearly impossible, but you got to know who you're working with and what you're actually writing. If you're just programming, you can probably get away with a lot, but just be aware of what's realistic in the future. And then chimes. So the chimes, also known as tubular bells, are like your church bell kind of sound. So let's see here. Oh. Yeah. So that's your typical pitched percussion. There's other stuff as well, of course. And then we move on to unpitched percussion. So unpitched percussion is going to be things like snare drums, bass drums, cymbals, gongs, tam-tams, triangles, really anything. So in the modern film scoring world, in the digital orchestration world, anything and everything can be unpitched percussion. Tchaikovsky used cannons, right? Damage, heavy oscillating damage is a really common one in modern film scoring. It's a pickaxe smashing a school bus window. There's all sorts of stuff that can be anything. So I'm just going to go through and play quite a few. Technically, I guess triangle has a pitch to it, but people don't treat it as pitched. And sometimes you have to actually work to find where it is. Your unpitched percussion sample libraries are going to be like all over the place in terms of which library decided to put what where. There's triangle. Obviously, we got some cymbals if we want to know where it is. Yeah, cymbals, snare. We got a lot more snares, of course. And perfect example, those are in different spots on my keyboard. Crazy. Anvil? That doesn't sound like an anvil to me, is that actually? Wow, it's a weak sauce anvil. Bass drum. No? Again, why is it in different spots? Big bass drum. And then you've got all the like hybrid stuff, different instrumental stuff from different libraries and stuff. So these are East-West Godzilla hits. All sorts of stuff. Ferrum trailer drums. And actually, I realize I have some EQing on that's messing these up real quick. Just built into the template. So let me fix that for you real quick. Yeah, so see if we can get... That's a better sound on the bass drums, right? Ferrum trailer drums. Maybe my anvil is better too. Nope, that's still a weak sauce anvil. All sorts of stuff. Taikos. Some more taikos. Even more taikos. And then you've got, this is actually damage itself. Let's just go to the full Armageddon ensemble. Yeah. And then of course you got weird stuff. Cool. Moving on. Strings. Gotta love strings. So strings, the big thing on strings is they are homogeneous and they basically sound the same except for ranges. So you've got your violin, which is a small one, the viola, which is slightly bigger. Take away one high string from the violin and add one lower string and you've got a viola basically. And then an octave down from that, you've got your cello, which is they play sitting down. And then upright is the big boy. And so these three, violin, viola, and cello, knowing the tunings of these is actually really important for knowing what is realistic and possible. So these are all tuned in fifths. So this is G, D, A, E. This is C, G, D, A from low to high, right? And then C, G, D, A as well. But then the upright bass is actually tuned in fourths. So it's E, A, D, G. So there are some things that are possible. And some things that aren't, especially if they're playing double stops. So the players can use the bow to actually play two strings at once, meaning basically chords. So some double stops are more realistic than others, obviously. And then there's a million different articulations and different things that they can do in terms of bowing, plucking, hitting the strings, all that sorts of stuff. Double basses are the ones that only really have a variable range. There's some weird like 7-string violins in the electric violin world and stuff, but double basses often in the professional world will have an extension on them, and so their low E actually goes down to a low C, and that's like a literal, it's like a mechanism on top that's like a locking mechanism, almost kind of like a capo a little bit where they place it. So there are some things there that are possible and some things that are not possible with that extension. So certainly keep that in mind. Most sample libraries definitely have that low extension accounted for. So violins. Yep. Violin twos, same thing. Viola, it's gonna be the same thing. It's just a little bit darker. I intentionally played like the same range there so you could hear how it's just slightly darker timbrely, but definitely does have some lower notes too. Cello. Oh, let's skip that. Yeah, you can do some. You can do some low stuff. Like cello's like the baritone of the strings, but you can do some low stuff and you can do some high stuff with cellos. And you'll notice they just all sound the same. That's still cello. And then basses are the low. And then with your extension. Something to keep in mind, with that extension, it would be very difficult to do things like half steps in that low range. Because it's sort of above the actual head scroll itself. But yeah, they're all basically the same. It's just like a range thing. And then you have harp. So harp is an interesting one because if you're trying to write realistically, harps, 47 strings I think is standard, but there's also different sizes obviously. But harps actually have a pedal system on them to determine what pitches are, what pitch the strings are. So typically everything is like in the key of C, where everything's natural, and then they have pedals that like move up and down to sharpen and flatten certain notes. And so if you're writing for harp, you actually can't super write like a bunch of super fast chromatic stuff, because then their feet would be like shifting all over the place or something, which is not really feasible in any capacity. And so harpists will, they have like little pedal chart markers on their sheet music oftentimes to show like what their pedal setup should be. But yeah, I think we all know what a harp sounds like, but yeah, that's a harp. Cool. And then there's a little chart here of the arrangement: first violin, second violins, left to right, high to low. Cool. So things to pay attention to when you're working with sample libraries, specifically with the orchestra, is the range you have on your instrument in the DAW is the concert pitch, not transposed pitch, unless it's just transposing by the octave. And then for unpitched stuff, it could be anywhere on the keyboard, depending on how they want to, the programmer wants to put it in. If you're writing for a real player, but programming with a sample library, contact a real musician who plays that instrument before writing too much. Sample libraries can sound great, but sometimes they'll let you write unrealistic stuff. And honestly, real players will write better than you will, probably. They just know their instrument better, and so they'll do things that you wouldn't have thought of. And so whenever I bring someone in to record and I have an idea that's written, I let them play with it a little bit and let them be musical and creative in their own way. And oftentimes they'll write something that's slightly better, slightly alternate. And then, of course, pay attention to the expression and vibrato of your woodwinds, brass, and strings. Is it realistic or possible? Also things like double stops, of course, and all that stuff. So there's definitely a realism that you are trying to achieve. But I hope that helped. That is your Symphonic Orchestra 101.